March 1st, 1943, 0430 hours, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The pre-dawn air clung heavy with the smell of oil, damp earth and sea salt carried inland from Simpson Harbour. Floodlights bathed the rows of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters in a ghostly pallor, their pale green fuselages slick with condensation. Ground crews moved among them in hurried silence, pulling canvas covers from cockpits, checking fuel lines, and running hands along the wings to brush away dew. Beyond the runway, the black outline of Rabaul's volcanic ridges rose against a horizon just beginning to soften with the first light of day. The base, nerve center of the Japanese South Pacific Command, was awake and bracing for war. In the operations hut, officers from the 8th Area Army and Southeast Area Fleet pored over maps pinned to plywood walls. Red and blue grease pencil markings traced the intended lifeline to Lae, on New Guinea's northern coast. 8 transports, heavily laden with nearly 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division, would depart Rabaul under escort of 8 destroyers, a flotilla designed to smash through Allied air patrols and reinforce the crumbling front in New Guinea. This convoy, officially designated Operation 81, represented Tokyo's gamble, a massive daylight run through waters the Americans already dominated by air. The Japanese commanders knew the risks. Since the Guadalcanal evacuation weeks earlier, Allied bombers had pressed closer and closer to New Guinea. Yet Lae had to be reinforced. Without troops, the garrison would collapse under Australian and American pressure, and the Bismarck barrier, the shield protecting Japan's outer perimeter, would be pierced. At the edge of the airstrip, a pilot adjusted the knot of his flight scarf with steady hands. Petty Officer First Class Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, just 21 years old, had already become a legend among his comrades. With over 50 confirmed kills to his name, some whispered it was closer to 70, he was hailed as one of the greatest natural aviators in the Imperial Navy. His colleagues nicknamed him the Devil of Rabaul, a Zero pilot whose graceful aerobatics masked deadly precision. Even among the famed aces of the 201st Kokutai, Nishizawa's reputation stood apart. This morning, like every morning, his demeanor betrayed nothing. Thin, sharp-eyed, his posture casual, he might have been mistaken for a clerk rather than a killer. But those who had flown beside him knew the truth. Nishizawa lived for the sky. He strapped into the Zero as if into a second skin, the controls extensions of his own nerves. His fighter waited for him now, paint worn from months of combat, engine humming faintly as mechanics primed it for the day's patrols. The A6M0 remained the heart of Japan's air power in 1943, light, agile, with a turning radius unmatched by any Allied fighter. Armed with twin 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannon, it was lethal in the hands of experts like Nishizawa. Yet for all its grace, the aircraft was fragile. Lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, it was a knife in a world where the Americans were learning to wield sledgehammers. Inside the headquarters, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa reviewed the final orders. The convoy would depart under cover of darkness, hugging the northern coast of New Britain before making the dash across the Bismarck Sea. Air cover would be provided by the elite Zero groups at Rabaul, Lae, and Kavieng. Nishizawa's 201st Kokutai was assigned high-priority escort missions. Their task was clear: shield the transports from Allied bombers at all costs. What the Japanese did not know, what no officer in Rabaul dared suspect, was that their plan was already compromised. In a concrete bunker thousands of miles away at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had broken the codes describing Operation 81. Through decrypted Japanese Navy messages, the Allies knew the convoy's composition, its departure time, its destination. Australian coast watchers hidden among the islands of the Bismarck archipelago waited to provide final sightings. In the coming days, waves of American and Australian aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, A-20 Havocks and bow fighters would converge on the shipping lanes with lethal precision. But in Rabaul, confidence reigned. The Japanese had reason to believe in their airmen. Since 1941, the Zero had reigned supreme, cutting swaths through Allied squadrons from the Philippines to the Solomons. Nishizawa himself had duelled with American P-40s and Australian Kitty Hawks, sending them down in flames with contemptuous ease. The thought that the Allies might turn the tide in the air seemed distant, almost impossible. On the flight line, pilots gathered in small knots, smoking cigarettes in the humid dark. They laughed quietly, trading jabs about who would score the most kills when the convoy came under attack. To the young men of the 201st, combat was both profession and proving ground. In the imperial code, to die in defense of emperor and empire was the highest calling. Yet Nishizawa's closest friends would later recall that his gaze often wandered beyond bravado. He spoke little of glory. He spoke instead of the purity of flight, of the exhilaration of climbing through cloud banks, of the serenity found in rolling an aircraft inverted against the endless blue. At 0500 hours, the convoy began to slip from Rabaul's harbour. One by one, the transports eased into the channel, destroyers taking flanking positions, their wakes glowing faintly in the half-light. On shore, Zero engines coughed to life. The roar of radial engines shattered the morning stillness. Nishizawa pulled his goggles over his eyes and signalled thumbs up to the ground crew. Moments later, his Zero surged forward, tail lifting, wheels leaving the ground as he climbed into the grey dawn. From above, the convoy stretched like a serpent across the sea, dark hulls slicing through swells that rolled in from the Bismarck archipelago. Nishizawa banked his aircraft, forming up with his wingmen. His mission was clear: to keep those ships alive. Below him, nearly 7,000 men packed into the transports, infantry, engineers, supplies, stood unaware that the very sea beneath them would soon become their grave. In Leh, Japanese officers prepared for their arrival. In Port Moresby, Allied air crews were already briefing for the strike. At Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts checked their decrypts one final time. The stage was set. For now, over Rabaul, only the sound of engines broke the morning calm. Nishizawa's Zero, wings glinting with dew in the rising sun, circled protectively over the convoy. He had no way of knowing that within 72 hours he would be fighting one of the most desperate air battles of his career, or that the sea below would be littered with burning ships and drowning men. For the pilots of the 201st Kokutai, March 1st dawned like any other day of war. But history was already in motion. The Allies had prepared a trap, and the convoy they guarded with such pride was steaming directly into it. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had begun. March 2nd, 1943. 0615 hours. Bismarck Sea, northeast of New Guinea. The morning broke clear and sharp, the horizon stained gold as the Japanese convoy steamed southward. 8 transports ploughed the waves in tight formation, their decks crowded with soldiers gazing out at endless water. The destroyers flanking them cut hard wakes, crews manning anti-aircraft batteries, eyes straining for signs of aircraft. Above them, the sky seemed infinite, yet every sailor knew it would soon fill with enemies. High overhead, the distant hum of engines signalled the day's first shadow. A lone B-24 Liberator of the U.S. 5th Air Force circled at 8,000 feet, its crew snapping photographs, radios crackling as they relayed bearings and speed. The Liberator's sighting report was received at Port Moresby within minutes. General George C. Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, had his confirmation. The Japanese convoy was exactly where decrypts had predicted. Allied intelligence had been watching for weeks. Thanks to code-breaking and Coast Watcher reports from New Britain, they knew the Japanese planned to reinforce Leh. Now, with the convoy exposed, Kenney unleashed his plan. a coordinated strike by American and Australian bombers, employing new tactics designed to annihilate shipping. This was not to be harassment, it was to be extermination. At Port Moresby, air crews gathered for final briefings. On chalkboards, the convoy's position was sketched in white, arrows indicating approach routes. B-17 flying fortresses would attack first from medium altitude, forcing the ships into defensive maneuvers. Then, B-25 Mitchells, modified with heavy machine gun packs in their noses, would roar in at mast height, strafing bridges and gun crews before releasing bombs at near sea level, a tactic known as skip bombing. Finally, A-20 Havocks and Bristol Beaufighters would rake the decks with cannon fire, killing anyone exposed. It was a combined arms doctrine forged in the crucible of the Pacific, untested on this scale but potentially decisive. While the Allies sharpened their knives, the Japanese convoy pressed on, unaware of the storm gathering. Overhead, the 201st Kokutai of Zeros orbited in pairs and flights, their engines a constant drone above the ships. Among them was Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, his A-6M cutting clean arcs through the air as he scanned for threats. He had flown dozens of escort missions before, but something about this one felt different. The convoy was large, the waters open, and the enemy, so far unseen, was almost certainly waiting. Below, sailors gazed upward with mingled awe and relief. The Zeros were their shield. For the infantry packed shoulder to shoulder in the transports, every passing shadow overhead was a reminder that survival rested on those slim-winged fighters. The Imperial Navy had promised air cover in strength. Men whispered prayers that it would be enough. At 10:30 hours, the first attack came. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses from the 43rd Bomb Group appeared high in the sky, sunlight glinting off their silver bellies. Alarm sirens wailed across the convoy. Black bursts of flak clawed upward, but the bombers pressed on, holding tight formation at 7,000 feet. The Zero escorts climbed hard to intercept. Nishizawa's throttle slammed forward, engine roaring as he angled toward the incoming wave. The bomb bays yawned open. Dozens of 500-pound bombs tumbled downward. Sailors screamed warnings. Destroyers heeled over in desperate evasive maneuvers. Bombs erupted in geysers around the transports, towering columns of seawater drenching decks, but no direct hits landed. The convoy had survived. Yet the bombers were only the prelude. Allied crews noted every evasive pattern, every zig and zag of the Japanese ships. They radioed corrections to the next wave. Meanwhile, Zeros tangled with the fortresses. Their cannon shells punched holes in fuselages, but the massive American aircraft absorbed punishment with astonishing resilience. Nishizawa made 2 firing passes, his 20mm shells tearing into a bomber's wing root, yet the aircraft held formation. Only when its left engine erupted in flame did it peel away, trailing smoke toward the horizon. Still, the B-17S returned fire with walls of .50 caliber bullets. One Zero disintegrated in mid-air, its wreckage spiraling into the sea. By noon, the convoy pressed onward, shaken but intact. The sailors believed they had weathered the worst. They were wrong. At Port Moresby, Kenney prepared the hammer blow. At 1330 hours, waves of B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocks lifted off, their engines thunderous across the airfield. Pilots tightened harnesses. Gunners checked belts of ammunition. Each Mitchell carried bombs fused for low-altitude impact, designed to skip across the waves like stones before slamming into hulls. For weeks, crews had trained at low level, perfecting the art of flying barely above the water's surface. Now they would test it against flesh and steel. At 14:45 hours, coast watchers reported the convoy still steaming southwest of New Britain. The trap was closing. Over the Bismarck Sea, Nishizawa and his fellow Zero pilots strained to maintain constant patrols. Fuel was running low. They landed in relays on makeshift strips at Leh and Gasmata, refueled hurriedly, and clawed back into the sky. Each time the convoy below seemed smaller, more vulnerable, a dark thread against the blue expanse. Nishizawa knew what was coming. The Americans would not stop with high-altitude raids. Something larger was underway. At 1500 hours, the sea to the south erupted with new shadows. Low on the horizon, dozens of aircraft skimmed the waves, their wings flashing in the sun. The Zero escorts dove to intercept, but their altitude was wrong, their angles poor. The Americans were already among the ships. The first B-25s screamed in at mast height, their nose-mounted machine guns hammering. Lines of tracers stitched across destroyer decks, cutting down gunners before they could fire. Then came the bombs, released at less than 200 feet. They skipped once, twice across the waves before slamming into hulls. Explosions ripped through the transports, fountains of fire and smoke rising amid geysers of shattered seawater. Nishizawa wheeled his Zero into the fray, guns blazing. He caught a Mitchell in his sights, shells striking its left engine. The bomber yawed hard, skimmed the waves, then cartwheeled into the sea in a spray of debris. But there were too many. Dozens more roared past, unloading devastation in relentless waves. From above, the B-17s returned, bombing from altitude while the Mitchells struck from below. Bowfighters raked decks with 20mm cannon fire. The convoy dissolved into chaos, ships ablaze, smoke boiling into the sky, sailors leaping into oil-slicked seas. Nishizawa's radio crackled with frantic calls. Transport hit. Destroyer sinking. His squadron fought desperately, Zero against bomber, but the mathematics were impossible. The Americans had turned the sea itself into a killing ground. By dusk, the first transports were sinking stern first, flames licking across decks. Survivors clung to wreckage as sharks circled. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had boarded in Rabaul, hundreds were already dead, with thousands more trapped below decks. For the Japanese pilots, the horror was immediate and personal. They had sworn to protect these ships, to deliver the reinforcements to Leh. Instead, they watched helplessly as the convoy bled out across the waves. Nishizawa's Zero, fuel gauges dipping toward empty, circled once more over the burning wrecks before turning reluctantly for base. He had scored kills that day, perhaps 3 bombers, maybe 4, but victory was meaningless amid such loss. At Rabaul, the radio reports painted a grim picture. Admiral Mikawa listened in silence as staff officers relayed news of transports aflame, destroyers crippled, thousands of men drowning. By nightfall, it was clear. The convoy's mission had failed. What was intended as reinforcement had become massacre. For Nishizawa and the surviving pilots of the 201st Kokutai, March 2nd ended with a bitter sunset. They had fought with courage, with skill, but against overwhelming firepower and flawless intelligence. The Americans had found the convoy, fixed it, and struck with precision never before seen in the Pacific. As darkness fell over the Bismarck Sea, the wreckage still burned. The storm had only begun. March 3rd, 1943. 0730 hours. Bismarck Sea. The morning dawned heavy with smoke. Across 50 square miles of ocean, wreckage drifted aimlessly. Oil-slicked corpses, shattered timbers, twisted steel plates rising and falling with the swell. 8 Japanese transports had started the voyage. By sunrise, 4 were already on the bottom, 2 more listing burning hulks that would not last the day. Above this graveyard in progress, the 201st Kokutai Zeros orbited, engines droning with exhausted rhythm. Among them, Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa peered from his canopy at the horror below. Men clung to rafts or driftwood, their arms waving desperately toward the passing aircraft. Some were comrades he had drunk with at Rabaul, soldiers full of bravado only days earlier. Now they bobbed helplessly in a sea stained black and red. The pilots could offer nothing. Nishizawa's radio crackled. All escorts, remain vigilant. Enemy bombers expected at any time the words came clipped, professional, but everyone knew what was coming. The Americans had struck hard on March 2nd. They would return today to finish the job. At 900 they did. From the north, formations of B-17 flying fortresses appeared first, their silhouettes massive against the pale sky. They droned in at 7,000 feet, bomb bays yawning open. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed upward from the surviving destroyers, but it was ragged, desperate, the guns manned by exhausted crews who had fought all night to keep their ships afloat. Nishizawa dove with 2 wingmen, cannon shells tearing into the bombers' formation. One fortress trailed smoke and fell out of line, but the rest held steady. Bombs tumbled down. Seconds later, explosions ripped through the already crippled transports. One ship, the Kyokusei Maru, split amidships, fireballs leaping skyward. Hundreds of troops trapped in its holds never surfaced. The convoy staggered onward, but its cohesion was broken. Survivors swam among burning wreckage, waving feebly as Zeros clawed skyward after the departing bombers. Nishizawa caught another B-17, raking it from wingtip to fuselage. Yet again the bomber soaked up punishment, leaking fuel, still flying. He cursed under his breath. Against fragile P-40s or P-39s, his gunnery had been lethal. Against these armoured behemoths, it was like clawing stone. At 10:30 hours, the second act began. From the south, skimming the waves, came B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocks, escorted by bowfighters. Their approach was masked by sea haze until they were almost on top of the ships. Then the ocean seemed to erupt. The skip-bombing runs were devastating. Mitchells roared in at mast height, their nose-mounted .50 caliber guns blazing, mowing down gunners before they could return fire. Bombs released at point-blank range skipped once, then slammed into hulls with thunderous impact. One transport was hit square amidships, its deck erupting into a sheet of flame as ammunition cooked off. Nishizawa hurled his Zero into the fray, streaking directly at a Mitchell that had just released its bomb. His cannon shells struck home, shattering the cockpit canopy. The bomber cartwheeled into the sea. But as he pulled clear, he saw another Mitchell's bombs strike a destroyer. The vessel shuddered, keeled, and rolled belly up in seconds. The sea swallowed 200 men before lifeboats could even be lowered. The bowfighters added to the slaughter. Flying at wave-top height, they unleashed streams of 20mm cannon fire into the packed transports. Survivors later recalled decks turned into slaughterhouses, men cut down in rows before they could dive for cover. The ocean churned with bodies, oil, and wreckage. By noon, the convoy was no longer a convoy. It was a collection of sinking hulks, burning wreckage, and frantic destroyers attempting rescues. Smoke rose in towering columns visible for 50 miles. The smell of burning oil, cordite, and charred flesh carried on the wind. For the Japanese airmen, the battle was both endless and hopeless. Each time they scrambled to meet incoming waves, fresh Allied squadrons appeared. The 5th Air Force had committed everything: fortresses, Mitchells, Havocks, bowfighters, even P-38 Lightnings flying top cover. It was an industrial sledgehammer, each blow methodical, each strike more destructive than the last. Nishizawa's Zero was everywhere at once, diving, climbing, slashing through bomber formations. He claimed multiple victories that day, 2 Mitchells, perhaps a Lightning, but he knew in his gut that none of it mattered. Every bomber destroyed was replaced by 10 more. Every Japanese pilot lost was irreplaceable. He watched friends fall blazing into the sea, their aircraft spiralling down like meteors. He forced himself not to look at the rafts below, where survivors waved as if the fighters could pluck them from death. At 1500, the final hammer blows fell. B-25s, making repeated mast-height attacks, sank the remaining transports one by one. The Teiyo Maru exploded in a sheet of flame visible for miles. The Taimei Maru rolled over, soldiers tumbling from its decks into shark-infested waters. The last transport, Oigawa Maru, was set ablaze stem to stern before finally sinking at 1700. Of the 8 transports that had left Rabaul, not one survived. The destroyers fought to rescue survivors, zigzagging amid burning oil slicks, pulling men aboard by the dozens. But Allied aircraft showed no mercy. Strafing runs raked lifeboats and crowded decks, killing hundreds more even after they had abandoned ship. It was not cruelty, but doctrine. The order was clear. Deny the enemy reinforcements at any cost. The 5th Air Force intended not just to sink ships, but to annihilate the soldiers they carried. By dusk, the ocean was a graveyard. Thousands of men still clung to debris, rafts, or simply floated lifeless in the swell. Sharks moved among them, drawn by blood and thrashing limbs. Survivors later described the nightmarish scene. Screams, cries for mothers, prayers shouted into the void, then sudden silence as men vanished beneath the waves. Nishizawa landed back at Leh that evening, his Zero pocked with bullet holes, fuel nearly exhausted. He was greeted not with triumph, but with stunned silence. Of the 6,900 troops embarked, fewer than 1,200 had been saved. The rest were dead, drowned, burned, or drifting in a sea where rescue was impossible. That night, in a makeshift command post lit by lanterns, Japanese officers confronted the truth. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not merely a defeat, it was a catastrophe. The reinforcement of Leh had been annihilated. The convoy doctrine that had sustained Japanese operations in the South Pacific was shattered. Never again would Tokyo attempt such a reinforcement by sea. For the Allies, it was validation. The skip bombing tactic had worked beyond expectations, proving that air power alone could obliterate shipping. For the Japanese, it was a revelation of industrial disparity. The Americans had not just struck hard, they had struck with inexhaustible strength, while Japanese pilots and sailors were consumed in irreplaceable numbers. Nishizawa sat apart from his comrades that night, silent, staring at the dark jungle beyond the airfield. He had fought with everything he had. He had added victories to his already legendary tally. Yet victory was meaningless. He had seen what air power and industry could do when combined. He had seen 6,000 comrades erased in 48 hours. The lesson was seared into him like fire across steel. Courage and skill were no longer enough. The tide of war was turning, not through tactics or individual valor, but through numbers, machines, and logistics. The age of the Zero's dominance was ending. March 3rd closed with the sea still burning, littered with wreckage and corpses. The Japanese called it a tragedy. The Allies called it a triumph. History would call it a turning point. March 4th, 1943. Bismarck Sea. The dawn revealed a sight beyond imagining. Smoke still curled upward from the sea, thin black columns marking where ships had burned themselves into the depths. The ocean was littered with wreckage, planks, lifeboats, oil drums, among which floated the bodies of men who had clung to life through the night, only to be claimed by exhaustion, cold, or the sharks that prowled the waters with patient hunger. The Japanese destroyers, battered and running low on ammunition and fuel, had spent the night combing the wreckage for survivors. They had pulled aboard hundreds, burned men with skin peeling in strips, soldiers half mad with thirst, sailors trembling from shock. But for every man saved, 10 more drifted out of reach, calling in hoarse voices until silence swallowed them. The South Pacific had become their grave. From Rabaul, reconnaissance aircraft circled, photographing the devastation. Each image confirmed the nightmare. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers lost or crippled, nearly 6,000 men dead. In Tokyo, when the reports arrived, silence fell across the Imperial General Staff. Some officers refused to believe the numbers. Others wept openly. The convoy had been the last hope of reinforcing New Guinea with strength sufficient to halt the Allied advance. Instead, it had been annihilated. At Leh, the 201st Kokutai pilots returned one by one, exhausted, their eyes hollow. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa climbed from his Zero, his uniform drenched in sweat, his face streaked with oil. Mechanics swarmed the aircraft, counting bullet holes, patching damage. But the pilot himself had no words. He had fought through 2 days of relentless air battles. He had claimed new victories, bombers, perhaps even a Lightning, but his hands still trembled on the mess cup of rice and tea offered by ground crew. He remembered faces, men on rafts waving frantically, comrades who had lifted cups of sake in Rabaul only days earlier. They were gone now, erased by the industrial hammer of American air power. In the pilot's tent that night, conversation was subdued. Some tried bravado, speaking of how many enemies they had downed. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Nishizawa said little. Inside, he felt the truth that none dared voice. The skies no longer belonged to the Zero. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea did more than sink ships. It destroyed an entire Japanese strategy. Until March 1943, Tokyo had believed it could reinforce distant garrisons by sea, slipping convoys through under the shield of destroyers and air escort. That illusion was shattered. Never again would the Japanese attempt to move major troop formations across the South Pacific by daylight convoy. From that week onward, reinforcement of isolated garrisons came by submarine or barges sneaking at night, pitiful dribbles compared to the thousands lost in the Bismarck Sea. For the Allies, the battle was a revelation. The skip-bombing tactics developed by General George Kenney's 5th Air Force had been vindicated beyond expectation. Medium bombers, flying low and fast, had proven deadlier to ships than high-level bombers ever could be. Air power alone had annihilated a major fleet movement without the intervention of surface ships. The future of naval warfare had been rewritten in the span of 48 hours. General Douglas MacArthur, reading the reports in his Port Moresby headquarters, issued a statement to the press. The Allies have smashed the Japanese attempt to reinforce Leh. The decisive Battle of New Guinea has been fought and won. Though the war would grind on for years, he was not entirely wrong. The Japanese offensive capability in the South Pacific had been broken. Of the 6,900 troops embarked, barely 1,200 reached Leh. The rest perished. Many never made it off their transports, killed by explosions in sealed holds. Others drowned as ships capsized or were machine-gunned while clinging to wreckage. Survivors later described the nightmare of the sea that night, the cries of thousands blending into a terrible chorus, then fading as dawn came and silence fell. The brutality of Allied strafing against survivors sparked debate even among some American airmen. But for 5th Air Force commanders, the logic was cruel and simple. Every soldier left alive would be another rifle firing at Allied troops in New Guinea. To guarantee victory on land, the convoy had to be not just defeated, but obliterated. Japanese diaries captured after the war testified to the psychological devastation. One soldier wrote on March 5th, "We have no hope now. We are sent to places where there is no supply, no rescue. The Americans strike from the air whenever they wish. We cannot move by day, cannot live by night. This is not war. This is extermination." For Nishizawa, the battle was a turning point. Already a legend among Japanese pilots, he had built his reputation in the heady days of 1942, when the Zero seemed invincible and the Imperial Navy swept across the Pacific. But the Bismarck Sea revealed a truth that no ace could deny. Individual skill could not halt industrial warfare. He thought of his victories, dozens, perhaps over 50, and realized their futility. For every bomber he destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every transport defended, the Americans sank too. He remembered watching Teiyo Maru explode, its decks crowded with soldiers waving at his passing Zero. His guns had been empty. He could only watch as hundreds vanished in flame. What use was his mastery of aerial combat when his comrades died in such numbers? That night he wrote a brief note in his logbook. "Courage is nothing against machines and numbers. We are told to fight to the death. But even if we die, the war will not change. Only more graves in the sea." The destruction at the Bismarck Sea had consequences far beyond New Guinea. For the Allies, it confirmed that the Japanese Navy could no longer guarantee supply lines in contested waters. It accelerated plans for the advance along the New Guinea coast, then into the Philippines. For Japan, it meant garrisons would wither on the vine, cut off from resupply, slowly starved into impotence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still commander of the combined fleet, received the report with grim resignation. He is said to have remarked, "The South Seas are lost. Our men will die in their islands, cut off from the empire within weeks." Yamamoto himself would be targeted in Operation Vengeance, his death another blow to Japanese morale. As March 4th ended, the Bismarck Sea was calm again. The oil fires had burned out. Wreckage drifted toward distant shores. Seabirds circled, diving on the remains. In Leh, soldiers stood on the beaches watching the horizon, waiting for comrades who would never come. For the Allies, it was a victory written in bold across the ocean. For the Japanese, it was a scar that would never heal. And for Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, it was the beginning of an inner reckoning, that even the greatest ace was powerless before the crushing weight of industrial war. March 1943 marked a turning point, not only in the Pacific campaign, but in the life of Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became proof of concept. Air power alone could halt and annihilate an enemy fleet. For Japan, it was a blow from which strategy, morale, and logistics would never recover. For Nishizawa, it planted the seed of fatalism, an awareness that his skill as a fighter ace could not alter the tide of a war shaped by production numbers, fuel stocks, and relentless attrition. In the weeks following the disaster, the Japanese High Command reeled. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers in just 2 days had reduced the reinforcement of Leh to a trickle. The 6,900 troops intended to bolster New Guinea defences had been meant as a keystone for holding the northern approaches to Australia. Instead, barely 1,200 men reached the shore, exhausted, half-drowned, stripped of weapons and supplies. The Imperial Navy concluded grimly that no daylight convoy of significant size could survive in contested waters. The sea, once Japan's lifeline, had become a killing ground. From March 1943 onward, resupply came by night through barges hugging the coast, by submarine carrying tiny cargoes, or by transport aircraft risking ambushes. None could match the scale of what was lost in the Bismarck Sea. Allied commanders quickly grasped the implications. General George Kenney wrote, "We have shown that ships cannot move by day in waters we control from the air. The Japanese have learned the lesson the hard way. They cannot reinforce New Guinea at will." MacArthur was emboldened, seeing in the wreckage the confirmation that his leapfrogging campaign up the northern New Guinea coast would succeed. For Nishizawa, stationed with the 201st Kokutai, the days after the battle were quiet but heavy. He flew patrols, he defended Leh and Rabaul, he claimed more victories in the months that followed. Yet something inside him shifted. He no longer laughed in the mess tent or boasted of kills. Fellow pilot Saburo Sakai later recalled Nishizawa as haunted after 1943, a man who still fought brilliantly but carried a shadow in his eyes. In his logbook, Nishizawa began noting not just the aircraft destroyed, but the ships sunk, the men lost, the sheer imbalance of resources. His handwriting, once bold, grew cramped, his words terse. Enemy bombers, many. Convoy destroyed, no end. What troubled him most was the futility. He had downed dozens of Allied aircraft, P-38s, P-40, B-17. Yet each time more appeared, wave after wave, supported by an inexhaustible engine of industry. He began to realize that his prowess, his vaunted status as the devil of Rabaul, could not alter the wider mathematics of war. For the Americans, the Japanese pilots remained formidable opponents. Reports from the 13th Fighter Command described Nishizawa's aggressive flying style, his uncanny marksmanship, his near-mystical ability to appear out of nowhere in a dogfight. Pilots who faced him often returned shaken, convinced they had encountered a foe beyond ordinary skill. Yet Allied intelligence also noted the changing balance. By mid-1943, losses among Japanese veterans were mounting, fuel was scarce, and replacement pilots arrived with fewer than 100 hours of training. Against them came waves of well-supplied Americans flying newer aircraft, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and soon P-51 Mustangs, backed by a logistical network that could replace aircraft faster than the Japanese could shoot them down. One US debriefing officer later wrote, "The Zero remains dangerous in skilled hands, but the hand itself is growing rare. We can afford to lose men and machines, they cannot." In Japan, news of the Bismarck Sea was initially censored. Official communiques spoke vaguely of heavy losses inflicted by enemy aircraft, but emphasized the bravery of soldiers who reached Leh. Yet rumors spread quickly among the ranks. Survivors whispered of entire ships annihilated, of sea lanes turned into fields of fire. By 1944, the phrase Bismarck Sea had become shorthand among Japanese troops for hopelessness, an example of how even courage and sacrifice could not withstand American air dominance. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence contained bitter remarks. "We are sent, like the men of Bismarck, to die in the water." For Nishizawa and his fellow aces, the battle was a reminder that their role had shifted. No longer could they hope to decisively protect convoys or dictate the terms of battle. Their missions became desperate rearguard actions, fighting to delay the inevitable advance of Allied forces. After March 1943, Nishizawa continued flying with distinction. He escorted bombers over Guadalcanal, fought American fighters over the Solomon Islands, and added to his tally of victories. By the summer of 1943, he was credited with over 80 kills, making him one of the top Japanese aces. Yet his fame became a burden. Commanders increasingly tried to ground him, fearing that his death would demoralize younger pilots. In October 1944, Nishizawa was ordered not to fly during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Frustrated, he reportedly begged to join his comrades, but was refused. Days later, while being ferried as a passenger in a transport plane, his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by US fighters over the Philippines. The man who had cheated death countless times in combat perished without a chance to fight back. For those who remembered him at Rabaul in 1943, it felt cruelly fitting. The ace who had survived the most desperate battles was felled not by skill, but by the crushing inevitability of Allied air superiority, the same inevitability he had glimpsed at the Bismarck Sea. Historians now mark the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as one of the most decisive air-sea actions of the Second World War. It demonstrated the effectiveness of skip bombing, validated air power as the dominant force in the Pacific, and sealed Japan's logistical fate in New Guinea. But beneath the numbers, the ships sunk, the men lost, the tons of supplies destroyed, lay human stories. Stories of Japanese soldiers who drowned within sight of shore, of American pilots who strafed survivors with grim determination, of Japanese aces like Nishizawa who fought valiantly, yet knew in their hearts that valor could not defeat abundance. At post-war conferences, Japanese officers admitted the battle had crushed morale. At the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, one veteran remarked, "From that day we knew, America could burn the sea itself if it wished. We were children playing with bamboo spears against a giant with steel fists." Standing on the tarmac at Rabaul in March 1943, Nishizawa had watched the convoys depart, proud columns of ships steaming into the Bismarck Sea. 3 days later, he saw only smoke on the horizon and empty water. He had defended them with all the skill a man could muster, and still they were gone. That memory haunted him until his death. For him, the Bismarck Sea was not just a battle lost, it was the moment he understood that Japan's war was doomed. An ace could win duels in the sky, but he could not outfly the weight of factories, fuel tanks, and supply lines stretching across oceans. The Zero still gleamed in the sun, nimble and deadly, but beneath its wings lay shadows cast by burning transports, sinking soldiers, and the thunder of American bombers. Nishizawa, the legend of the Zero, had seen the truth in fire and smoke. The empire he defended was bleeding out into the Pacific, one convoy at a time. The destruction of the Japanese convoy in March 1943 was not an accident of fortune. It was the product of innovation, preparation, and ruthless adaptation by Allied airmen who refused to accept the limitations of conventional doctrine. For Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, dueling among the clouds in his A6M0, the devastation below was a reminder that even the finest fighter pilot could not shield a fleet from weapons that rewrote the rules of war. Before the Bismarck Sea, attacking ships from the air followed a frustrating pattern. High-level bombers dropped their payloads from 10,000 feet, but ships manoeuvred easily, and hits were rare. Dive bombers, like the U.S. Navy's SBD Dauntless, could be effective, but required dangerous approaches that exposed aircraft to heavy flak. Torpedo bombers offered promise, but Allied torpedoes in the early Pacific War often malfunctioned, running too deep or failing to detonate. General George C. Kenney, commander of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, demanded a solution. His pilots, flying at treetop height against barges and coastal shipping, had experimented with a crude but effective tactic, releasing bombs at low altitude so they would skip across the water's surface like stones thrown across a pond. The Australians had tried it first in 1942, improvising against Japanese supply barges in New Guinea. The Americans refined it, training their B-25 Mitchell crews until the technique became second nature. The method was brutally simple. Aircraft would descend to 50 feet above the sea, approach head-on at full throttle, and release bombs fitted with delayed fuses. The bombs would ricochet off the surface, slam into the hull of a ship, and explode seconds later, often below the waterline where armour was weakest. At ranges under 500 yards, accuracy was devastating. By early 1943, Kenney's men were ready to test the technique on a major target. The convoy steaming toward Leh would be the proving ground. On March 3, 1943, waves of Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese transports. From the north came B-17 flying fortresses, bombing from medium altitude to scatter formations and force evasive manoeuvres. From the south swept in the low-level attackers, squadrons of B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocks, flying so low their propellers threw spray off the waves. Japanese destroyers opened fire, their 5-inch guns hammering the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. But the attackers pressed in, heedless of flak. One B-25 pilot recalled, "We were flying so low we could see the expressions on the sailors' faces as they fired back. Then we let the bombs go, and it was like throwing a sledgehammer." The results were immediate. Bombs skipped across the surface, striking amidships with devastating precision. One transport, struck by two 500-pounders, erupted in fireball columns that reached 200 feet high. Another broke in half within minutes, sinking beneath the churned sea. For the Japanese survivors, it was bewildering. Accustomed to high-altitude attacks they could dodge, they now faced weapons that came in fast, low, and unstoppable. Allied pilots described seeing sailors running for lifeboats even before bombs struck, the panic palpable on decks already strafed by machine guns. Amid the chaos, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and his fellow Zero pilots fought furiously to blunt the attack. Their task was almost impossible. Low-level attackers were hard to intercept, darting beneath the altitude where the Zeros excelled. attempting to dive into the maelstrom of flak risked being shot down by their own ship's guns. Instead, Nishizawa focused on the escorting fighters, P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks that swirled above the convoy. Accounts from Allied pilots describe Zeros diving with surgical precision, their 20mm cannons spitting fire. Some Mitchells fell, riddled and ablaze, but the majority pressed home their runs. Nishizawa claimed several kills that day, but he could not halt the slaughter below. He later remarked to fellow pilots that our ships were not sunk by bombs, but by the method of attack. Even the best air cover could not stop what was essentially point-blank artillery delivered from the sky. The brilliance of the Bismarck Sea attack lay not only in skip bombing, but in coordination. Allied intelligence, through intercepted Japanese codes, had tracked the convoy's route precisely. Reconnaissance aircraft shadowed it day and night, reporting positions in real time. At the tactical level, Kenney orchestrated his squadrons like a conductor leading an orchestra. High-level bombers disrupted formations. Medium-altitude aircraft dropped bombs to drive ships into predictable paths. Then the low-level attackers delivered the killing blows. Fighter escorts sealed the skies, forcing Japanese pilots like Nishizawa into duels while the slaughter unfolded below. In 2 days, the Allies sank all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Out of 6,900 troops embarked, fewer than 1,300 reached Leh. Most drowned or were strafed in the water. The loss was catastrophic not only in numbers, but in morale. The shock of the defeat led the Japanese to attempt countermeasures. They reinforced convoy escorts, added more anti-aircraft guns, and experimented with smoke screens. They even considered adopting their own low-level bombing techniques. But without time, fuel, or training resources, such adaptations never matched Allied efficiency. Worse still, the Imperial Navy faced a dilemma. Heavy escorts consumed fuel Japan could not spare. Every convoy became a gamble, every ship a dwindling resource. After March 1943, large-scale daylight convoys virtually ceased. Resupply came instead by barge and submarine, slow and insufficient. The Japanese army in New Guinea began starving not from enemy bullets, but from logistical strangulation. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a textbook case in the evolution of air power. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later concluded, the successful employment of low-level skip bombing tactics demonstrated the decisive application of air power against naval forces. The Japanese failure to adapt rendered further surface reinforcement impossible. For the Allies, the battle validated faith in tactical innovation. It showed that air power could achieve what fleets of battleships once did, command the seas. For Nishizawa, however, it was a bitter lesson in the limits of individual skill. A pilot could duel and win, but he could not rewrite the geometry of tactics or the industrial weight behind Allied innovation. Skip bombing was not elegant. It was brutal, close range, and merciless. But it was effective, and in war effectiveness was all that mattered. The Japanese convoy had sailed with confidence, protected by destroyers and aces like Nishizawa. It had been annihilated in less than 48 hours by men flying low, throwing bombs like stones across water. From the decks of burning transports, Japanese soldiers looked skyward and saw not just airplanes, but the embodiment of a new era, an era where the sea could no longer protect them, where even the mightiest convoy could be destroyed by wings and bombs. Nishizawa, circling above in his Zero, understood this before most. He saw the truth written in smoke and fire. The future of warfare belonged not to ships or even to fighters, but to the relentless innovation of air power backed by industrial might. The fires of the Bismarck Sea still smouldered as Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's Zero touched down at Lakunai airfield, Rabaul. The tropical heat shimmered off the tarmac, but the mood among the surviving pilots was chilled, haunted by the spectacle they had just witnessed. On March 5, 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army counted their losses. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers gone, nearly 6,000 troops swallowed by the sea. It was a defeat not just of ships and men, but of a strategy and a belief that Japanese forces could still reinforce New Guinea and hold the initiative in the South Pacific. For Nishizawa, already hailed as one of Japan's greatest fighter aces, the aftermath was sobering. He had fought brilliantly, claimed multiple victories in aerial combat, and yet nothing he or his comrades had done had altered the outcome below. The convoy was gone, destroyed not by battleships or submarines, but by aircraft flying lower than the waves, using methods that Japanese planners had dismissed as reckless improvisation. In his tent at Rabaul, Nishizawa wrote to a fellow pilot that "Our Zero is unmatched in the sky when flown with skill, but skill is useless if the ships we defend are drowned before we can turn the tide." It was a telling admission. For a man who believed in the martial spirit of the Japanese fighter arm, the realization that technology, tactics, and industrial ingenuity could neutralize even the finest pilot's efforts weighed heavily. The loss of the Bismarck Sea convoy crippled Japan's plans in New Guinea. Those 6,900 soldiers had been intended to reinforce Lae and strengthen the defences against Allied advances from Port Moresby. Without them, the Japanese garrison at Lae remained vulnerable, short of manpower and supplies. From that moment, large-scale troop movements by sea to northern New Guinea ceased. Japan was forced to rely on barges, submarines, and small coastal craft, methods that could move only hundreds, not thousands, of men at a time. These Tokyo Express runs across the Bismarck and Solomon Seas were perilous, constantly harried by Allied aircraft. Starvation and disease spread among isolated garrisons. As one Japanese officer later testified during post-war interrogations, "The sea itself became our enemy." The disaster also broke the back of Japanese confidence in daylight convoy operations. After March 1943, imperial planners grew hesitant, even paralyzed, when faced with the challenge of reinforcing forward positions. Every attempt risked annihilation from the air. For the Allies, the victory at the Bismarck Sea was electrifying. General George Kenney called it the decisive aerial battle of the Southwest Pacific. In Washington and Canberra, headlines trumpeted the annihilation of a convoy that had dared to steam under Allied-controlled skies. Newspapers reported Japanese soldiers machine-gunned in lifeboats, painting the episode as both ruthless and necessary. The message was unmistakable. The Allies now commanded the sea lanes not with fleets of warships, but with wings of bombers and fighters. The morale boost extended beyond propaganda. Pilots and crews who had doubted the value of their unorthodox training in skip bombing now saw it validated with devastating clarity. From that point forward, skip bombing became standard doctrine, employed across the Pacific in attacks on shipping, harbours, and even fortifications. The Bismarck Sea revealed a truth that Japanese leaders had long denied. Air power had supplanted naval power as the decisive arbiter of the Pacific. In 1941, Japan had stunned the world with Pearl Harbor, demonstrating the reach of carrier aircraft. But by 1943, the equation had shifted again. Now it was land-based Allied aircraft, supplied by pipelines of fuel and endless production lines of bombs that made entire oceans impassable for Japan. A captured Japanese staff officer later told Allied interrogators, "After the Bismarck Sea, we no longer believed reinforcements could reach New Guinea by ship." It was as if the Americans had built invisible walls across the sea. For Nishizawa personally, the battle deepened his reputation as a pilot, but also planted seeds of doubt. Already he had been dubbed the Demon of Rabaul, his tally climbing past 50 confirmed kills. Yet even he could see the handwriting on the wall. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was increasingly vulnerable to new Allied fighters like the P-38 Lightning. Its lack of armour and self-sealing tanks, once dismissed as unnecessary in favour of manoeuvrability, now left it at a disadvantage in prolonged engagements. Nishizawa confided to comrades that he feared Japan's technical edge had vanished. "We are lions in the sky," he said after the battle, "but our prey is endless and our claws grow dull." Strategically, the destruction of the convoy sealed Japan's fate in New Guinea. Without reinforcement, Leh fell to Allied forces in September 1943, opening the way for General Douglas MacArthur's advance up the northern coast. From there, Allied forces leapfrogged westward, isolating Japanese bases and cutting off supply lines. Each step traced back to the annihilation at the Bismarck Sea. Historians later described the battle as the death knell of Japanese offensive capability in the South Pacific. Dr. Richard Overy, writing in the Pacific War, argued, "The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ended the possibility of Japan regaining the initiative. Thereafter, its forces fought a defensive war of attrition, starved by Allied command of the seas and skies. Post-war interrogations confirmed how deeply the defeat scarred Japanese morale. Survivors described the terror of Allied aircraft swooping low, bombs skipping like stones, machine guns raking the sea itself. One soldier, rescued days later, recalled, 'The ocean burned. We swam through fire.' For the Americans and Australians, the battle became a case study in the marriage of intelligence, innovation, and courage. For Japan, it was a grim reminder that spirit alone could not overcome material disadvantage. Nishizawa survived the battle and continued flying, racking up victories through 1943 and into 1944. Yet even his legend could not escape the tide of history. In October 1944, as Japan prepared for the desperate defense of the Philippines, Nishizawa was killed not in combat, but as a passenger aboard a transport plane shot down by American fighters. It was a bitter irony. The ace who had survived countless dogfights perished defenseless in the very kind of vulnerable aircraft he had once tried to protect. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than a clash of ships and aircraft. It was the collision of two doctrines, one rooted in courage and tradition, the other in innovation and industrial might. Nishizawa's Zero danced through the sky with unmatched grace, but below him the convoy was reduced to flaming wrecks by bombs that skipped like stones across water. History remembers the battle not only as a turning point, but as a lesson etched in fire and steel. In modern war, brilliance in the cockpit could not outweigh the combined weight of technology, tactics, and production. For Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, it was the beginning of the end, not of his career, but of the illusion that Japan could still master the Pacific. For Japan itself, it marked the moment when the rising sun began to set. We've reached the end of the battle narrative in Chapter 7, where the Japanese convoy was destroyed, Nishizawa survived, and the consequences were explored. Since you asked to continue to the next part, the natural progression would be an epilogue, a closing chapter that places Nishizawa and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in the broader arc of the Pacific War and his legacy as a pilot. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ended not in tactical stalemate, but in annihilation. By March 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had lost the ability to reinforce New Guinea effectively. In Tokyo, the news was softened for public morale, reported as a hard-fought battle with exaggerated Allied losses. But inside the halls of the Naval General Staff, the truth was undeniable. Japan's logistical reach had been cut short, its strategic momentum broken. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, stationed back at Rabaul, lived through the consequences firsthand. In the weeks following the battle, he saw fewer reinforcements arriving, fewer supplies reaching the front, and more desperate measures being taken to sustain isolated garrisons. Barges and small craft replaced the once proud convoys, creeping along coastlines by night, easy prey for Allied patrols. The Zero pilots, including Nishizawa, were increasingly tasked with escorting these makeshift runs, missions that felt less like honourable combat and more like delaying the inevitable. Despite the disaster at sea, Nishizawa's personal legend continued to grow. By mid-1943, he was credited with more than 60 aerial victories, earning the reverence of younger pilots who saw him as the embodiment of Japanese skill and daring. His peers nicknamed him the Devil of Rabaul, not only for his flying ability but for his aura in combat, cool, relentless, seemingly untouchable. Accounts from comrades describe him as quiet and introspective off-duty, but transformed once in the cockpit. He flew his Zero as if it were an extension of his body, coaxing manoeuvres others thought impossible, pushing the machine to its limits. To the Allied pilots who fought him, his name became whispered shorthand for the deadliest adversary in the skies of New Guinea. Yet Nishizawa's victories increasingly carried the hollow echo of futility. For every bomber or fighter downed, the Allies produced more. For every convoy protected, another was lost. He had begun to sense what even his superiors would not admit aloud. The war was slipping beyond Japan's grasp. The Bismarck Sea had shown the Japanese that air power, not surface fleets, ruled the South Pacific. It also marked the beginning of a war of attrition that Japan could never win. Allied production surged, flooding bases with fresh aircraft and replacement pilots. American and Australian squadrons rotated regularly, allowing crews to rest, refit and learn. By contrast, Nishizawa and his comrades at Rabaul fought without respite. Shortages of fuel and spare parts strained operations. Many replacements sent to the front were poorly trained, sometimes with fewer than 100 hours of flight time before combat. The Zero, once the pinnacle of design, was no longer unchallenged. The twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, with its speed, firepower and range, became a formidable adversary. Pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire hunted the skies around New Guinea, matching skill with industrial strength. Nishizawa, for all his prowess, could not alter the arithmetic of war. Even as he scored victory after victory, Japan's air arm dwindled, bled white by losses it could not replace. The aftermath of the Bismarck Sea also deepened the moral burden on Japanese pilots. Survivors of the convoy told harrowing stories of troops left struggling in burning seas, strafed by Allied aircraft as they clung to wreckage. Many pilots carried the guilt of failing to protect their comrades, no matter how bravely they fought. Nishizawa, though not given to open displays of emotion, was haunted by these memories. One ground crewman recalled him staring out to sea after a mission, silent for hours, refusing food. Another pilot later wrote in his diary that Nishizawa spoke of the ocean as a graveyard built by fire. Historians now regard the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a decisive turning point. It marked the moment Japan lost the capacity to project force into New Guinea. Allied forces, emboldened by the victory, pushed steadily forward. Leh fell in September 1943, followed by Salamaua. From there, the Allies advanced through the Huon Peninsula and into western New Guinea, each step isolating more Japanese troops, cutting off their supplies and eroding their will. In Tokyo, debates raged over whether to reinforce or withdraw. Pride dictated holding every inch. Reality made it impossible. The lessons of the Bismarck Sea, where an entire convoy had been erased in 2 days, loomed over every discussion. For Nishizawa, the years after Bismarck were both triumphant and tragic. His victory count continued to climb, surpassing 80 confirmed kills. He became one of the most celebrated Japanese aces, his name spoken alongside Saburo Sakai and others. Yet he lived to see his world shrink, from Rabaul to the Philippines, from a war of conquest to one of desperate defense. In October 1944, Nishizawa was ordered to escort kamikaze aircraft during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Though he flew the mission with his usual skill, he was killed days later, not in combat, but as a passenger aboard a transport plane shot down by American fighters. The irony was cruel. Japan's most feared living pilot perished not in a duel of skill, but helpless in the very kind of vulnerable transport he had once tried to shield. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains etched in military history as one of the most decisive examples of air power determining the outcome of a campaign. For the Allies, it was proof that innovation, skip bombing, coordinated low-level attacks, integration of intelligence and operations could offset even entrenched defences. For Japan, it was a disaster that symbolized the vulnerability of empire to logistics, production, and the unrelenting advance of industrial war. For Nishizawa, the battle was both a testament to his brilliance and a reminder of his helplessness. He fought gallantly, downing enemies and surviving dogfights that would have killed lesser men. Yet all his skill could not save the transports below, could not turn back the tide of history sweeping across the Pacific. In later years, when veterans gathered and historians debated, the story of Hiroyoshi Nishizawa in the Bismarck Sea became a symbol of the clash between individual valor and structural inevitability. His Zero danced above the burning sea, victorious in the sky yet powerless to alter the catastrophe beneath him. The lesson was stark. Wars in the modern age were not decided by single heroes, no matter how skilled, but by the weight of production, logistics, and innovation. The Allies could afford to lose planes and pilots and still fight on stronger the next day. Japan, by contrast, could ill afford a single convoy lost, and yet lost them all. As one Japanese officer, interrogated in 1946, bitterly concluded, "At the Bismarck Sea, we discovered courage was meaningless without supply. Even the greatest pilot could not fly enough to feed an army." For Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, that truth became his shadow, a legacy of brilliance in a war his nation could not win. His name endures in the annals of aviation, a reminder that skill and sacrifice, though noble, are powerless against the arithmetic of modern war. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, Japan was in ruins. Cities lay flattened by bombing, its navy sunk, its skies stripped of aircraft. In the immediate aftermath, few spoke openly of the war. Veterans returned to shattered homes, many carrying memories too painful to share. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa was not among them. Killed in October 1944, he did not live to see surrender or occupation. His absence made him both untouchable and idealized. In a nation searching for symbols, Nishizawa became part of a pantheon of fallen eagles, men whose courage contrasted with the humiliation of defeat. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, former comrades began writing memoirs. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war despite being badly wounded, often spoke of Nishizawa as the genius of aerial combat, a man who embodied the purity of the fighter pilot's spirit. Yet the official record was fragmentary. Japanese combat reports had been destroyed or lost. Victory claims, often inflated in the fog of war, could not be reconciled with Allied records. Still, the legend grew. Nishizawa, the ace of aces, the pilot who might have had more than 100 kills, the man who inspired fear even among Allied veterans. Much of Nishizawa's reputation was tied to the machine he flew, the Mitsubishi A6M0. Before the war, it was revolutionary, long-ranged, agile, lethal in the hands of masters like Nishizawa. In 1940, it swept aside Chinese and British opposition. In 1941–42, it dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. But by 1943, at the time of the Bismarck Sea, the Zero was already sliding toward obsolescence. It lacked armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and the speed of newer Allied types. The battle highlighted the contradiction. Nishizawa could outfly nearly any opponent in a turning duel, yet Allied P-38s and P-40s could dive, climb, and disengage at will. Skill kept him alive, but technology was tilting the balance. In the post-war years, the Zero became a symbol of both pride and tragedy in Japan. Museums displayed surviving aircraft as relics. Writers and filmmakers portrayed them as beautiful but doomed, like cherry blossoms falling in spring. Nishizawa, inseparable from his Zero, fit this narrative perfectly. Brilliant, ephemeral, consumed by a war Japan could not win. In contrast, American and Australian records of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea rarely mention Nishizawa by name. To the Allies, the story was about logistics and innovation, skip bombing, coordinated strikes, and the destruction of Japanese reinforcements. Pilots who fought in those skies remembered the ferocity of Japanese defence, but they measured success in ships sunk and convoys destroyed, not in duels with individual aces. Yet Allied veterans who encountered Nishizawa or his squadron acknowledged the skill of their adversaries. Oral histories recorded in the 1960s and 1980s include testimony from US pilots who recalled 1-0 that seemed to anticipate every move. In hindsight, historians have speculated that many of these encounters involved Nishizawa, though certainty is impossible. The Allies respected him not as a name, but as an archetype, the deadly Zero pilot who fought with uncanny precision. Post-war scholarship has struggled to pin down Nishizawa's exact tally. Some sources credit him with more than 80 victories, others suggest fewer than 40 confirmed against Allied records. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Japanese pilots often claimed group kills, and confirmation standards were looser than Allied procedures. What is beyond dispute is his reputation among peers. Testimony from fellow pilots consistently places him at the pinnacle of skill. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea illustrates this paradox. Nishizawa probably downed several aircraft during the two-day battle, though precise numbers are uncertain. But the outcome, total destruction of the convoy, dwarfed any individual achievement. Historians emphasize this point. Personal heroism could not alter systemic failure. Nishizawa's brilliance was real, but strategically irrelevant. By the 1960s, Japan's relationship with the war had shifted. Economic recovery fostered nostalgia, even romanticism, about the sacrifices of the wartime generation. Books like Samurai, by Martin Kaidin and Saburo Sakai, 1957, introduced Western readers to figures like Nishizawa, framing them as chivalric warriors rather than instruments of militarism. For many Japanese, Nishizawa represented lost potential, not only of an individual but of a nation that had gambled on war. His early death preserved his image unsullied by defeat or compromise. Unlike political leaders, he carried no stigma of responsibility. He could be remembered as pure courage in an impure war. At reunions of former naval aviators in the 1970s and 1980s, Nishizawa's name was invoked with reverence. Veterans spoke of his uncanny instincts, his ability to sense danger before others, his artistry in flight. Some insisted he was the greatest pilot Japan ever produced, greater even than Sakai or Ota. In these gatherings, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was remembered less as a disaster and more as a crucible that revealed his brilliance. Western historians, beginning in the 1980s, took a more critical view. Using Allied combat reports and Japanese diaries, they reconstructed the battle as an object lesson in modern warfare. Intelligence, air power, and logistics crushing bravery and tradition. Within this framework, Nishizawa became a symbol of the old order, a knightly figure outmatched by industrial war. His role at Bismarck was acknowledged but contextualized as one thread in a larger tapestry of strategic defeat. Still, even critical accounts often pause to note his personal skill. Smithsonian curators, displaying a restored Zero, include in their placards references to Nishizawa as among its most famous pilots. At conferences and in scholarly works, his name recurs as shorthand for the paradox of the Zero. Brilliant in the hands of masters, yet ultimately doomed. What is often forgotten amid statistics and strategy is the man himself. Nishizawa was only 22 years old at the time of the Bismarck Sea, scarcely older than the American and Australian pilots he fought. He had grown up in rural Japan, joined the Navy as a teenager, and found in flying both purpose and transcendence. His letters, few that survive, reveal a man conscious of his mortality, aware that each mission might be his last. One surviving line, quoted in a comrade's memoir, reads simply, "The sky is vast, but my time in it will be short." It is a haunting echo of the cherry blossom metaphor so often invoked in Japanese culture. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands today as more than a tactical victory. It was a moment when modern warfare's realities were laid bare, intelligence networks guiding bombers, coordinated strikes overwhelming defences, industrial might translating into destruction. For Japan, it was a warning that could not be ignored, yet one from which they could not recover. For Nishizawa, it was a chapter in which his skill shone, yet his powerlessness was exposed. He fought brilliantly in the air, but could not save the men drowning below. His Zero still inspires awe in museums, his name still echoes in books and reunions, but the battle reminds us that even the greatest pilot could not change the tide of war. In the end, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's story is not one of victory or defeat alone, but of contradiction. He was both legend and man, ace and mourner, symbol of brilliance and witness to catastrophe. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea crystallized these contradictions. It showed the world that courage, however luminous, could not outshine the machinery of industrial war. And so his legacy endures, the genius in the Zero, the hero who could not alter history, the man who flew into the gathering storm and emerged as myth. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not the end of Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's war. For Japan, it was the beginning of an irreversible decline in the South Pacific. Convoys could no longer be sent to New Guinea without catastrophic losses. The garrisons at Leh and Salamaua withered, cut off from resupply. Allied forces, using the strategy of island hopping, bypassed strongholds and strangled them into irrelevance. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, once the terror of Asia, found themselves on the defensive everywhere. For Nishizawa, however, survival meant continued combat. He remained with the 201st Kokutai, flying missions from Rabaul, from the Philippines, and later over the Marianas. He added to his tally of victories, claims that pushed his reputation ever higher. By 1944, his name was whispered with awe among new recruits, many of whom had only a fraction of his experience. He was called the Devil of Rabaul, the demon pilot, the one man who could never be shot down. Yet behind the myth was a grim reality. Each month, his comrades disappeared. Squadrons that had once boasted seasoned aces were now filled with boys barely trained, thrown into cockpits with less than 100 flight hours. Nishizawa was becoming an elder statesman in his early 20s. The A6M0 that had carried him through so many battles was no longer supreme. By 1943, the Allies fielded faster, stronger aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning. Unlike the Zero, these planes had armour, self-sealing tanks, and powerful engines that gave them both speed and climb advantages. In dogfights, Nishizawa could still outmaneuver opponents, but only through sheer genius. For average Japanese pilots, the Zero was a death trap. The Bismarck Sea had already foreshadowed this truth. There, Nishizawa had survived, but he had also seen Allied fighters dictate the terms of battle. After 1943, this became the norm. Japan's great strategic gamble, to win quickly before American industry fully mobilized, had failed. Now men like Nishizawa were asked to fight impossible battles, sustaining honor even as defeat loomed. Accounts from surviving comrades suggest that Nishizawa grew increasingly fatalistic. He joked less, spoke more quietly, and carried the demeanor of a man who knew his days were numbered. Fellow ace Saburo Sakai recalled him saying in 1944, "I will not survive this war. The sky has given me life, but it will take me too." Yet he continued to fly with unmatched intensity. He volunteered for missions others dreaded. He taught rookies how to maximize the Zero's agility, how to survive against overwhelming odds. To some he seemed reckless, as though courting death. To others he was fulfilling the code of the warrior, Bushido in its purest form. By autumn 1944, the tide of war had fully turned. The Americans landed in the Philippines, triggering the massive naval clash known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. For Japan, it was the final gamble, the last chance to halt the US advance. It was also the birth of the kamikaze strategy, deliberate suicide attacks by aircraft. Nishizawa did not die in one of these missions, though some accounts say he offered. Instead, he was assigned to escort kamikaze flights, protecting the young men who would crash their planes into American ships. It was a cruel irony. The most gifted Japanese fighter pilot was reduced to shepherding novices on one-way trips. On October 25, 1944, Nishizawa reportedly flew one of his greatest missions, destroying several American aircraft while covering a kamikaze strike. That evening, he told comrades that his time was near. The next day, he was not scheduled for combat. Instead, he boarded a transport aircraft to travel to another base. Somewhere over the Philippines, American fighters intercepted the transport. The unarmed plane was shot down. Nishizawa, the terror of the skies, died not in a dogfight but as a passenger, unable to touch the controls. He was 24 years old. News of his death spread quickly among surviving Japanese airmen. To many, it was shattering. If Nishizawa could be killed, anyone could. His passing symbolized the end of an era, the extinguishing of a flame that had burned brighter than all others. For decades after, veterans would speak of him with reverence, often with tears. The exact number of his victories remains debated. Official Japanese tallies suggest around 87. Some comrades believed it exceeded 100. Allied cross-references place it lower. But in truth, the numbers mattered less than the impression he left. He was the pilot other pilots measured themselves against. His legend, like that of the Zero itself, transcended statistics. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had already shown the world that even the greatest pilots could not alter strategic reality. Courage and skill were real, but they were no match for radar, code-breaking, and overwhelming industrial production. Nishizawa's later career only reinforced this truth. Time and again he demonstrated brilliance, yet Japan still lost the skies. Historians often describe him as a tragic figure, an artist of aerial combat born into a war his country could not win. In this sense, he resembled the Zero itself, beautiful, deadly, but ultimately unsustainable. He belonged to the early war of maneuver and daring. By 1943, that war was already gone. In post-war Japan, Nishizawa came to embody both pride and sorrow. He was remembered not as a tool of militarism, but as a young man who gave everything. For Americans, his name is less familiar, but among aviation historians he is recognized as one of the greatest natural pilots of the Second World War. At reunions decades later, both Japanese and American veterans spoke of him as the kind of opponent who ennobled the struggle. Even in a war of brutality, his skill commanded respect. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa's journey, from the tropical airfields of Rabaul through the maelstrom of the Bismarck Sea to his death in the Philippines, captures the essence of Japan's air war. Brilliant individuals fighting with unmatched courage, yet powerless against the vast machinery of modern conflict. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was his crucible, a moment where his genius shone, but also where the futility of that genius was exposed. He fought magnificently, yet could not save the convoy, could not alter Japan's destiny. In that paradox lies his enduring legacy. Today, visitors to museums see the preserved Zero with its slender wings and graceful lines. They read placards about Nishizawa, Sakai, and others. They learn of battles long past. But if they listen closely, they might still sense what it meant to fly into the storm in 1943, to be a young man, barely out of adolescence, carrying the weight of honor and the inevitability of loss. Nishizawa did not live to see peace. Yet in the memory of comrades, in the annals of aviation history, and in the echo of the Zero's engine, he remains immortal, the last samurai of the skies.